"Don't drink that," she whispered to the Duke, spilling the wine. He approached her and said 2 words. The chandeliers of Stirling Estate blazed with 1,000 candles, casting golden light across the royal masquerade that had consumed London's gossip for weeks. Lady Evangeline Pembroke stood behind an ivory column at the edge of the grand hall, her emerald gown blending into the shadows as she observed the glittering crowd with the quiet intensity of someone who saw too much and said too little. At 23, Evangeline possessed what her late grandmother had called a dangerous gift, the ability to read people the way scholars read ancient texts, noticing the pauses between words, the flickers of expression that betrayed hidden truths, the micro-movements that exposed lies. Her father, Lord Pembroke, had stopped introducing her to potential suitors after the 5th gentleman complained that being near her felt like standing before a magistrate. "You're doing it again," murmured her cousin Isabel, materializing beside her with a crystal flute of champagne. "That look. The one that makes everyone think you're plotting something sinister instead of simply existing. Smash that subscribe button like it's a crime scene. You don't want to miss what's coming next." Evangeline accepted the glass with a barely perceptible smile. "I cannot help it if most people are transparent. Lord Whitmore will spill wine on himself within the next 3 minutes. He always does when nervous. Lady Dalton will claim a headache the moment Baron Vane arrives because she owes him money. And someone will inevitably ask our host about the origins of his fortune, though everyone already knows the answer." "Speaking of our host," Isabel said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "have you actually seen the Earl yet? They say he's devastatingly handsome but completely untouchable. Father mentioned he once destroyed a business rival's entire operation simply because the man insulted his late mother at a garden party." "Men don't destroy lives over insults, Isabel. That's theatrical nonsense. Then explain why half the ladies here look like they want to worship him, and the other half look like they'd rather face a firing squad than catch his attention." Evangeline had heard the rumors, naturally. Who hadn't? Julian Stirling, Earl of Glassford, 29 years old, inherited his title at 18 after a carriage accident claimed both parents, built an empire from shipping investments and property acquisitions that made even the old money aristocrats nervous. But it was his reputation that preceded him like a gathering storm, brilliant, calculating, utterly ruthless when crossed. A man who had rejected every marriage proposal arranged by well-meaning relatives, only to throw this masquerade and invite every eligible woman in London, as though daring society to interest him. "There he is," Isabel breathed, and Evangeline's gaze tracked to the center of the ballroom. She understood immediately why people whispered with that particular mix of fear and fascination. Julian Stirling stood near the marble staircase, tall and commanding in midnight blue evening, wear that seemed designed to make every other man look like an afterthought. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been sculpted by an artist obsessed with sharp edges and aristocratic perfection, with eyes the color of smoke that seemed to dissect every person they touched. He wasn't handsome in the soft, approachable way of London's favorite lords. He was something far more dangerous, magnetic, intense, the sort of man who could ruin your life with a glance or save it with a word. "Good heavens," Isabel murmured. "The rumors don't begin to capture it." "He's just a man, Isabel. A man who looks like he could read your darkest secret while signing your death warrant." Evangeline was about to respond when the majordomo's voice cut through the music. "Distinguished guests, His Lordship requests your presence in the dining hall. Supper is served." The procession into the dining room followed the suffocating hierarchy of rank. Earls and their families first, followed by viscounts, then barons in descending order of importance. Evangeline found herself seated near the middle of an endless table that gleamed with silver and crystal, Isabel on her left and a gossiping baroness on her right, who immediately began complaining about the scandalous behavior of someone's daughter-in-law. The Earl sat at the head of the table, naturally, with Baron Silas Vane and his wife positioned in seats of honor close by. Silas Vane was a man in his 40s with political connections and a smile that never quite reached his calculating gray eyes. His wife, Lady Catherine Vane, possessed the kind of practiced elegance that came from a lifetime of studying how to appear perfect, her auburn hair arranged in elaborate curls, her ruby necklace catching the light with every calculated movement. Evangeline had encountered them both at previous functions. Something about the Baron made her skin crawl, though she couldn't articulate precisely why. Perhaps it was how his compliments felt like traps, or how his laughter always seemed to mock whoever stood nearest, or how his eyes followed people with a cold assessment of a predator selecting prey. The first course arrived, a delicate soup that steamed in porcelain bowls painted with gold leaf. Conversation flowed in waves of meaningless chatter. Lady Whitmore discussed her son's upcoming appointment to Parliament. Lord Harrison debated hunting regulations with increasing volume. Isabel kicked Evangeline under the table and nodded toward a young lord across from them who'd been staring with obvious admiration. "Mr. Edmund Blackwood," Isabel whispered. "Third son of the Duke of Westmere. Father mentioned him yesterday as a suitable prospect. Father mentions many gentlemen. I'm not a prize mare at auction." "No, but you are 23 and showing no signs of accepting any courtship. At this rate, you'll end up like Aunt Philippa, living in the country with 17 cats and a collection of pressed flowers." "Aunt Philippa is perfectly content, and her cats are delightful company." The second course arrived, then the third. Evangeline found herself relaxing fractionally, the wine and ambient warmth softening her usual guardedness. Perhaps this evening wouldn't be as unbearable as she'd anticipated. Then her attention snagged on something wrong. Baron Silas Vane had risen from his seat, ostensibly to speak with someone several chairs away. But as he passed behind the Earl's chair, Evangeline caught a movement so swift, so practiced, that she almost dismissed it as a trick of the candlelight. Almost. The Baron's hand, concealed within the folds of his coat, withdrew something small, a silver ring with a hidden compartment, no larger than a sovereign coin. The movement was rehearsed, smooth, the gesture of someone who had perfected this exact action. As Lady Catherine engaged the Earl in animated conversation about art acquisitions, gesturing expansively enough to command attention, her husband's fingers moved with surgical precision above Julian's wine goblet. The ring opened. A fine powder, barely visible against the white tablecloth, dusted into the Earl's wine, so little that anyone not watching would never notice. Evangeline's heart stopped, then slammed against her ribs like a prisoner against iron bars. Time fractured. Each second stretched impossibly long. The Baron slipped the ring back onto his finger, his expression never changing, his pleasant smile remaining perfectly in place. Lady Catherine laughed at something the Earl said, her hand touching his sleeve in a gesture of false warmth that made Evangeline's stomach turn. No one else had seen. The entire room continued their conversations, oblivious to the murder unfolding in plain sight. The Earl reached for his wine glass, his long fingers wrapping around the crystal stem. Evangeline didn't think. Didn't calculate the consequences or weigh the cost to her reputation or consider the scandal that was about to detonate across London society. She simply moved. Rising from her chair so abruptly it scraped against marble, she crossed the space between her seat and the Earl's in 4 desperate strides. Conversation stuttered. Heads turned. She felt the weight of 100 eyes, felt the pressure of judgment beginning to crush down, but her entire focus remained fixed on that wine glass rising toward those smoke-colored eyes. "Don't drink that," she whispered urgently, her hand shooting out. Her fingers struck the goblet. Wine exploded across the pristine white tablecloth in a spreading crimson stain that looked disturbingly, prophetically, like blood. Crystal shattered against silver, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the sudden, devastating silence. Every conversation died. Every eye turned toward her. The weight of the aristocracy's shock pressed down like a physical force. The Earl's eyes, those infamous calculating smoke-gray eyes, fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. Up close they were even more penetrating than she'd imagined, containing depths that seemed to calculate 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 questions, in the space between heartbeats. "Lady Evangeline," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "That was my wine." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, before she could consider the irreversible damage about to rain down on her family's name. It was poisoned. The gasp that rippled through the assembled nobility was almost physical. Someone's fork clattered against china. A woman's shocked inhale cut through the air. Poisoned. Lady Catherine's voice rose in perfectly performed indignation. "Your Grace, I'm terribly sorry, but it seems Lady Pembroke has had far too much champagne herself. The poor dear must be confused." Baron Vane stood, his face flushing with theatrical outrage. "This is absolutely outrageous. My wife and I are honored guests in this house, and we're being slandered by this delusional girl." "I am neither delusional nor confused," Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the trembling that had seized her hands, despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I saw Baron Vane add something to the Earl's wine from a concealed ring just moments ago as he passed behind his chair. A powder. Colorless. Deadly." "You saw no such thing." Lady Catherine's hand flew to her throat in theatrical horror. "I was merely speaking with Lady Worthington." The Baron was greeting Lord Ashford. "You're mistaken, child." "These social occasions can be overwhelming," Baron Vane said, his tone dripping with condescension that made her want to scream. "Especially for young ladies of nervous disposition. Perhaps you should retire to the drawing-room and compose yourself before you cause further embarrassment." Evangeline felt heat flood her face, not from shame, but from pure incandescent rage. "I am not mistaken. I know exactly what I saw." "This is scandalous," Lady Whitmore announced to the room at large. "To make such vile accusations without a shred of proof." "Someone should send for Lord Pembroke," another voice suggested. "His daughter clearly needs to be removed before she destroys what remains of her reputation." The words struck like physical blows. Evangeline felt the ballroom closing in, felt the crushing weight of judgment from every direction, felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. She had acted on instinct, on absolute certainty, but standing here now with the entire aristocracy staring at her like she'd lost her sanity, doubt began its insidious whisper. What if the candlelight had deceived her? What if stress and wine had conspired to create shadows where none existed? What if she just destroyed her family's standing over a terrible, irreversible mistake? Then Julian Sterling moved. His hand, large, warm, utterly steady, closed around hers. The gesture was gentle, but unmistakable. Every eye in the room tracked the movement with shock bordering on disbelief. The Earl of Glassford stood slowly, his considerable height making everyone else seem small, inconsequential. He didn't release Evangeline's trembling hand. Instead, his grip tightened fractionally, anchoring her when she felt herself beginning to drown. He looked down at her, those smoke-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt like standing at the center of a storm, and in a voice that carried to every corner of the deathly silent dining hall, Julian Sterling spoke two words that would change everything. "Marry me." If you're loving the suspense, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe and let's get into it. The silence that followed Evangeline's accusation was suffocating, pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. She stood there, hands still outstretched toward the shattered wine glass, watching crimson liquid seep into the pristine tablecloth like an omen she couldn't interpret. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this room full of condemning stares, but her legs had turned to marble beneath her gown. Baron Silas Vane's expression shifted from theatrical outrage to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculated fury that transformed his pleasant features into something predatory. He took a step toward her, and Evangeline fought the urge to retreat. "Your Grace," the Baron said, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he addressed Julian Sterling, "I apologize profusely for this disturbance. Lady Pembroke has always been peculiar. Her father has mentioned her nervous afflictions before." He turned to face Evangeline fully, and his eyes held a warning that made her blood run cold. Poor, obsessed girl. It's truly tragic when a young woman becomes so desperate for attention that she resorts to wild fantasies and destructive behavior. The word obsessed landed like a slap. Around the table, Evangeline could feel the narrative shifting, could sense the aristocracy's collective consciousness beginning to accept this new interpretation. Not a hero who saved a life, but a delusional woman having some sort of episode. The sympathetic glances being thrown her way weren't compassion, they were pity mixed with embarrassment. "My dear Lady Evangeline," Lady Catherine added with practiced concern, "perhaps you've developed an unhealthy fixation on his lordship? It's not uncommon for young ladies to confuse admiration with reality when they've had too much wine." Evangeline felt the trap closing around her like iron jaws. Every word she spoke now would only make it worse. Defend herself, and she'd sound hysterical. Stay silent, and she'd be confirming their assessment. Her father's reputation, her family's standing, everything was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Someone really should escort her out," Lord Whitmore murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear, "before this becomes even more uncomfortable." "I'll send for a physician," another voice suggested. "The girl clearly needs medical attention." The room began to move, began to close in. Evangeline saw Baron Vane's lips curve into the smallest smile of triumph, saw Lady Catherine exchange a satisfied glance with her husband. They had won. Somehow, impossibly, they had turned attempted murder into a story about an unstable woman's delusions, and everyone was believing it. Then Julian Sterling's hand closed around hers. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm. His palm was warm, solid, real in a moment when everything else felt like it was dissolving into nightmare. Evangeline's gaze snapped up to his face, and what she saw there stole the breath from her lungs. Those smoke-gray eyes weren't filled with pity or disgust or confusion. They held something else entirely, a fierce, burning intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. He was reading her the way she read others, weighing her truth in the space between heartbeats. Julian Sterling stood slowly, his considerable height making everyone else at the table seem insignificant. He didn't release Evangeline's hand. Instead, his fingers interlaced with hers in a gesture so intimate, so unmistakable, that gasps rippled through the assembled nobility. "Lady Evangeline is not obsessed," Julian said, his voice carrying through the dining hall with quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. "She is observant. There is a difference that escapes those who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths." Baron Vane's smile faltered. "Your Grace, surely you don't believe." "I believe," Julian interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass, "that this woman just risked everything, her reputation, her family's standing, her entire future, to save the life of someone she barely knows." He turned to face Evangeline fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her feel like they were the only two people in the room. That kind of courage deserves more than our doubt. It deserves our protection. Evangeline's heart hammered so violently she was certain everyone could hear it. "My lord, There's only one way to shield you from the retaliation that will surely come," Julian continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, meant only for her though everyone strained to hear. "Only one position that grants enough power to make you untouchable." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Evangeline saw the calculation in his eyes, the chess game playing out in real time. He was offering her sanctuary, but it came with a price, a binding that would change both their lives forever. Julian Sterling lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that sent shockwaves through the watching crowd, and spoke 2 words that detonated like cannon fire across London's social landscape. "Marry me." The dining hall erupted. Shouts of disbelief, gasps of shock, the sound of Lady Whitmore's champagne glass shattering against the floor. But Evangeline barely heard any of it. She stood frozen, staring into the eyes of a man who had just offered her salvation wrapped in scandal, protection purchased with her freedom. Baron Vane's face had gone ashen, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling to dust. Because an obsessed, delusional girl doesn't receive marriage proposals from England's most eligible earl. A woman who told the truth does. "Yes," Evangeline whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it, before she could think about consequences or calculate costs. "Yes, I'll marry you." Julian's smile was small, dangerous, and wholly triumphant. He pulled her closer, and in front of the entire aristocracy, in front of the Baron who had tried to destroy them both, he murmured words meant only for her ears. "Now the real game begins." Want to see more wild stories? Click subscribe and become part of the squad. The study door closed with a decisive click that sounded remarkably like a prison cell locking. Evangeline stood in the center of Julian Sterling's private sanctuary, acutely aware that she was alone with a man she'd met mere hours ago, a man to whom she was now publicly engaged. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and something darker she couldn't quite identify. Danger, perhaps. Or secrets that had aged like expensive wine. Julian moved to the sideboard without speaking, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid that caught the firelight. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and Evangeline found herself studying him with the same intensity she'd used to spot the poison. Now that the performance was over, would the mask slip? Would she see the real man beneath the calculated heroics? "You're wondering if you made a terrible mistake," Julian said without turning around, and Evangeline's breath caught. Could he read her as easily as she read others? "I'm wondering," she replied carefully, "why a man who barely knows me would stake his reputation on a stranger's word and propose marriage within minutes of meeting." Julian turned, extending a glass toward her. When she hesitated, one corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "If I wanted to poison you, Lady Evangeline, I'd have let you leave the dining room and handled it privately. Much less dramatic." The dark humor shouldn't have reassured her, but somehow it did. She took the glass, their fingers brushing in the exchange, and the contact sent that same electric current racing through her veins. "You're not answering my question, Lord Sterling." "Julian," he corrected, settling into the leather chair behind his massive desk. "We're engaged now. We should at least pretend to be familiar with each other." He gestured to the chair across from him, and Evangeline sat, spine straight, every muscle coiled with tension. "Very well, Julian. Why did you propose to me?" He studied her over the rim of his glass, those smoke-gray eyes seeing far too much. "Because Baron Silas Vane has been trying to kill me for the past 3 months, and you're the first person who's actually caught him in the act." The admission hit her like a physical blow. 3 months? And you've done nothing. "I've done everything," Julian said, his voice turning sharp with frustration. "I've hired investigators, changed my routines, had my food tested, my wine examined, my correspondence screened. But Vane is careful, meticulous. He leaves no evidence, no witnesses, nothing that would stand up to scrutiny or legal challenge." He leaned forward, intensity radiating from him like heat. "Until you." Evangeline's mind raced, connecting pieces she hadn't known existed. The shipping investments. Your father's route to the East Indies. The Baron wants everything, Julian finished grimly. My fortune, my title's influence, my trade connections. He's been positioning himself as my trusted advisor while slowly poisoning me, planning to swoop in as the grieving friend who takes over my affairs when I conveniently die of some unnamed illness. His jaw tightened. He would have succeeded tonight. Why not simply expose what I saw? Call for an investigation. With what evidence? A shattered wineglass and the word of a woman the entire aristocracy now believes had too much champagne. Julian's expression turned regretful. No offense intended, but by the time we could prove anything, Vane would have destroyed every trace and painted us both as conspirators in some mad scheme. The truth of it settled over Evangeline like ice water. So the engagement is a shield, Julian said bluntly. For both of us. As my fiancé, you have my protection, my resources, my name. Vane can't move against you without moving against me, and he won't risk open confrontation now that people are watching. He paused, and something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like regret. But it also makes you a target. Evangeline's blood went cold. What do you mean? If Vane can't kill me directly anymore, he'll try to hurt me through you. Scandals, accidents, reputation destruction, whatever causes me the most pain. Julian's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. He'll see you as both a threat who exposed him and a weapon he can use against me. You understand what that means. She did. The moment she'd knocked that wine glass from Julian's hand, she'd painted a target on her own back. The Baron wouldn't forgive her intervention. Wouldn't forget that she'd seen through his careful performance. And now, bound to Julian through engagement, she'd become leverage in a game whose stakes she was only beginning to comprehend. You're offering me a contract, Evangeline said slowly, her analytical mind cutting through emotion to see the transaction beneath. Protection in exchange for what exactly? Julian's expression turned fierce, predatory. Help me hunt him. Use those observation skills that spotted a poisoning no one else saw. Be my eyes in society while I work in the shadows. Together, we find proof that destroys Vane before he destroys us. He stood, moving around the desk until he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. 1 year. We maintain this engagement, expose the Baron, and then you're free to walk away with enough dowry to marry whoever you choose, or remain unmarried with financial independence. Your choice. And if we fail? Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer. Then we both die, Julian said simply. Probably in ways that look tragically accidental. Evangeline's hand trembled slightly as she raised her glass, the amber liquid catching the firelight. 1 year of living a lie. 1 year of danger. 1 year pretending to be engaged to a man whose eyes held secrets she couldn't begin to decipher. The smart choice would be to refuse, to run back to her father's estate and pray the Baron forgot about her. But Evangeline had never been particularly smart about self-preservation. I have conditions, she said. Julian's smile was slow, dangerous, and appreciative. I'd expect nothing less. No lies between us. If we're hunting a predator, we can't afford deception in our own partnership. She met his gaze steadily. And when this is over, if I choose to walk away, you let me go without protest or manipulation. Agreed. Julian extended his hand, and Evangeline took it, sealing a bargain that felt far more binding than any formal engagement could be. His fingers tightened around hers, and for just a moment, she saw something flicker in those smoke-gray eyes, something that looked almost like relief. Or perhaps hunger. She couldn't tell which frightened her more. Welcome to the game, Lady Evangeline, Julian murmured. "Let's hope we both survive it." Join the crew. Hit subscribe and let's keep this mystery train rolling. The letter arrived on the 5th morning of their engagement, delivered with the casual cruelty of a knife between the ribs. Evangeline sat in Julian's drawing room, their drawing room now, according to the gossip sheets, when her father's steward appeared at the door, his face ashen. "My lady," he stammered, "your father asked me to deliver this personally." Her hands shook as she broke the seal. The words swam before her eyes, each one a hammer blow: gambling debts, outstanding loans, properties mortgaged beyond recovery, creditors demanding immediate payment. £20,000. Her family was ruined, and somehow, impossibly, every debt holder in London had received notice on the same day. "Let me see it." Julian's voice came from behind her, and she hadn't even heard him enter. His presence had become so familiar in mere days that her body recognized him before her mind did. The shift in air pressure, the faint scent of sandalwood and ink. She handed him the letter wordlessly, watching his jaw tighten as he scanned the contents. "It's vain," he said flatly. "He's either fabricated these debts entirely or bought up real ones to weaponize them. This is his opening move." "My father," Evangeline's voice cracked. "This will destroy him." "That's the point." Julian knelt before her chair, his hands covering hers, and the warmth of his touch anchored her spiraling panic. "He's showing us he can hurt you. Can hurt anyone you love. He wants you to break the engagement, to remove yourself from my protection so he can silence you permanently." The next blow came that afternoon at Lady Whitmore's garden party, which they'd been forced to attend to maintain appearances. Evangeline felt the whispers like spiderwebs catching at her skin as she walked through the manicured hedges on Julian's arm. His hand at the small of her back was meant to be possessive, territorial, part of their performance. But his thumb traced small circles against her spine through the fabric of her gown, a gesture of comfort no one else could see. "Lady Evangeline," Baron Vane's voice cut through the afternoon air like ice. He approached with Lady Catherine at his side, both wearing expressions of theatrical concern. "I heard the most distressing news about your family's financial troubles. Such a shame. One wonders if certain young ladies pursue advantageous marriages out of genuine affection or pure desperation." The insinuation hung in the air like poison gas. Around them, conversation stuttered. Eyes turned their direction with renewed speculation. Evangeline felt Julian's hand tighten against her back, felt the coiled tension in his body. "One wonders," Julian said, his voice dangerously soft, "if certain men hide their own inadequacies behind anonymous attacks on innocent families. It seems a coward strategy, don't you think, Baron?" Vane's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Merely expressing concern for my dear friends. After all, sudden engagements following dramatic incidents do invite scrutiny." He leaned closer, dropping his voice. "People are beginning to ask questions, Your Grace. About motives. About money. About what Lady Evangeline might have to gain from such convenient accusations." The threat was clear. Vane was constructing a narrative where Evangeline had fabricated the poisoning attempt to trap Julian into marriage and save her family from ruin. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and looking at the speculative faces surrounding them, Evangeline realized it was working. That evening, they retreated to Julian's study, the only place that felt safe anymore. Evangeline paced before the fireplace, her mind racing through scenarios, each one ending in disaster. "He's boxing us in. Every move we make, he's 3 steps ahead. Then we stop reacting and start anticipating." Julian caught her wrist as she passed, pulling her to a stop. They stood close enough that she could see gold flecks in his gray eyes, could feel his breath against her forehead. "We know his next move will be more public, more damaging. He'll want an audience. The royal ball, Evangeline whispered. Next week. Everyone will be there. Perfect stage for a scandal. Julian's hand slid from her wrist to her palm, fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become unconsciously natural. We'll need to be convincing. More than convincing. We need London to believe we're desperately in love. And how do we do that? Evangeline asked, though her heart was already hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. Julian's free hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. We practice, he murmured, and something in his expression made her breath catch. This wasn't part of their contract. This wasn't strategic calculation. This was something rawer, more dangerous. Julian. His name escaped her lips like a prayer or a warning, she couldn't tell which. Tell me to stop. His forehead touched hers, and Evangeline's eyes fluttered closed. Tell me this is just performance, just part of the game, and I'll step back. But she couldn't. Because somewhere between contract negotiations and midnight strategy sessions, between his protective touches and the way he looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world of masks, the lines had blurred beyond recognition. She didn't know when the fake engagement had started feeling real, when his presence had become necessary rather than convenient, when she'd stopped seeing him as a means of survival and started seeing him as more. I can't tell you that, she whispered against his lips, because I'd be lying. And we promised no lies between us. Julian's kiss was gentle at first, testing, asking permission she'd already granted. Then his hand threaded through her hair, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like falling and flying simultaneously. Evangeline's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and uncertain. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian pressed his forehead to hers again. This complicates things, he said roughly. Everything was already complicated, Evangeline replied, and felt his chest rumble with dark laughter. We're hunting a killer, your family's facing ruin, all of London thinks you're a fortune hunter, and now he stopped, jaw tightening. You're what? She asked, though part of her feared the answer. Julian's eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Now I'm terrified of losing you. Not because it would ruin our plan, but because somewhere in this elaborate deception, you became the only person in London I actually trust. The only person who sees the real me. Julian, A sharp knock shattered the moment. Julian's steward entered, face grave. Your Grace, a message arrived. From an anonymous source. He extended a sealed envelope with trembling hands. Julian opened it, and Evangeline watched the blood drain from his face. He handed her the single sheet of paper without a word. The message was brief, written in elegant script that somehow made the words more chilling. How unfortunate if something were to happen to Lady Evangeline at the royal ball. Accidents happen so easily in crowds. Perhaps she should reconsider this ill-advised engagement before someone gets hurt. A friend. Evangeline's hands trembled as the threat sank in. Baron Vane wasn't just attacking her reputation anymore. He was planning something far worse, and he wanted her to know it was coming. Julian pulled her against his chest, his arms forming a cage of protection that they both knew wouldn't be enough. He's escalating, he murmured against her hair. Which means we're running out of time. Then we end this at the ball, Evangeline said, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear clawing at her throat. We trap him, expose him, finish this before he can strike. Or we die trying, Julian said grimly. Together, Evangeline replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The game had just become deadly serious, and neither of them was certain they'd survive the final move. Don't be a stranger. Subscribe now and let's dive deeper into the unknown. The royal ball glittered with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off jewels and silk until the ballroom resembled a treasure chest come to life. Evangeline descended the marble staircase on Julian's arm, hyper-aware of every eye tracking their entrance, every whisper that followed in their wake. She wore midnight blue, his choice, with diamonds at her throat that had belonged to his mother. The weight of them felt like both armor and shackles. "He's here," Julian murmured against her ear, his lips brushing her temple in what looked like affection but was pure strategy. "Northeast corner, near the champagne fountain. He's waiting for something." Evangeline didn't turn her head, but her eyes found Baron Vane immediately. He stood with Lady Catherine, both dressed in coordinated silver that made them look like matching daggers. The Baron's gaze locked with hers across the crowded ballroom, and his smile was the smile of a serpent that had finally cornered its prey. The evening crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Evangeline danced with Julian, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization born from a week of frantic practice, and something deeper, something neither of them had named aloud since that kiss in his study. His hand burned against her waist. Her fingers trembled in his grip. Between them hummed an electric current of fear and desire, and the terrible knowledge that this night would end in triumph or tragedy with no middle ground. "Lady Evangeline." Baron Vane's voice cut through the music as the dance ended. He bowed with mocking courtesy. "Might I request the honor of the next waltz? Surely your fiancé can spare you for one dance." Every instinct screamed refusal, but Evangeline saw the trap within the trap. If she refused, she looked afraid, weak, guilty. "Of course, Baron," she said smoothly, feeling Julian's hand tighten briefly on hers before releasing her. Vane's grip was cold as he led her onto the floor. "You should have accepted my warning," he said conversationally as they began to move. "Such a shame that your stubbornness will cost you everything." "Is that a threat, Baron?" "A promise." His smile widened. "You see, I've just delivered a letter to Lord Pemberton, President of the Royal Society and confidant to the Prince Regent. A letter containing very detailed allegations about your father's debts, your desperate circumstances, and Julian Sterling's, shall we say, questionable mental state since his parents' death." Evangeline's blood went cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "Allegations aren't evidence." "No, but they're enough to launch an investigation. And investigations have a way of uncovering all sorts of inconvenient truths." His fingers dug into her waist. "By tomorrow morning, questions will be raised about Julian's competency to manage his estates. Questions about whether a man who'd proposed to a fortune-hunting scandal-maker is fit to hold his title. The courts might decide he needs a guardian to oversee his affairs." His breath ghosted across her ear. "Someone trusted. Someone like me." The full scope of his plan crashed over her like a wave. It was brilliant and monstrous. Even if they survived tonight, Vane would strip Julian of everything through legal maneuvering, using their engagement as evidence of instability. And once he controlled Julian's fortune, both their deaths would be simple matters to arrange. Unless she could stop it right now. "You've made a critical error, Baron," Evangeline said softly, her mind racing 3 steps ahead. "Have I?" He sounded amused. "You assume Lord Pemberton hasn't already read a very different letter. One that arrived this afternoon, detailing your purchase of my family's fabricated debts, including copies of forged documents with your signature. Julian has excellent investigators, you see." It was a complete bluff. They had no such evidence. But Evangeline had learned that the best lies lived closest to truths people feared. Vane's step faltered. "Just for a moment, but enough. You're lying." "Am I?" "Lord Pemberton is standing right there." Evangeline nodded toward a distinguished gentleman near the orchestra. "Why don't we ask him which letter he finds more compelling?" The one accusing Julian of madness, or the one proving you've been systematically forging financial documents and orchestrating attempted murder? You have no proof of murder. I have a wine glass, Evangeline interrupted, her voice sharp as breaking crystal. The one from the masquerade. Julian kept it. Had the residue tested by 3 separate chemists. Arsenic, Baron. Enough to kill within hours. Another lie, but his face had gone ashen. And we have testimony from your wine merchant about the special vintage you purchased the day before the ball. Turns out he keeps meticulous records. The music swelled around them, but Vane had stopped moving entirely. Other couples glided past, curious eyes noting their frozen tableau. This is blackmail, he hissed. No, this is checkmate. Evangeline stepped back, her voice rising just enough to carry. You have one choice, Baron. Confess everything publicly right now, and perhaps the courts show mercy. Or force my hand, and I'll destroy you piece by piece until there's nothing left but your title and the knowledge that a woman you dismissed as hysterical outsmarted you at every turn. You wouldn't dare. Don't drink that. Evangeline's voice rang across the ballroom with deliberate echo of that first night. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. She just commanded the attention of every aristocrat in London. Baron Silas Vane poisoned Julian Sterling's wine at the masquerade. He's been systematically attempting murder to steal my fiancée's fortune. And he just confessed the entire plot to me on this very dance floor. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Vane's face twisted with rage and panic. She's lying. The woman is delusional. Then explain this. Julian's voice cut through the noise as he strode forward, holding a sealed envelope aloft. Baron Vane's correspondence with a known poisoner in Dover, intercepted by customs officials yesterday. Detailed instructions for acquiring arsenic. Payment receipts. Everything. He'd had it all along, Evangeline realized. They'd been waiting for Vane to make his final move, so the confession would damn him completely. Palace guards materialized from the edges of the room. Lord Pemberton stepped forward, his face grave. Baron Vane, you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy. Take him. Vane lunged toward Evangeline with a snarl of pure hatred, but Julian was faster. His fist connected with Vane's jaw with a crack that echoed through the ballroom. The Baron crumpled, and the guards dragged him away as Lady Catherine shrieked protests that no one heard. Then Julian was pulling Evangeline into his arms, his heart hammering against hers. The ballroom faded, the staring faces, the gasps and whispers, everything except the man holding her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. It's over, he whispered into her hair. You were magnificent. Terrifying and magnificent. Evangeline pulled back just enough to see his face, to read the truth written in those smoke-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams. The contract. Forget the contract. Julian's hands cupped her face with trembling reverence. Marry me. Not because of some agreement or protection or strategy. Marry me because I'm desperately, irrevocably in love with you, and the thought of you walking away now would destroy me more completely than Vane ever could. Tears blurred Evangeline's vision. Julian, You can say no, he continued roughly. If this was only ever survival for you, I'll honor our agreement. I'll let you go. But if there's any chance that you feel even a fraction of what I feel. She kissed him. There, in front of all of London, in front of the Prince Regent himself, she rose on her toes and kissed Julian Sterling with everything she had, all the fear and hope and impossible love that had grown in the shadows of their dangerous game. When they broke apart, the ballroom exploded in applause. Yes, Evangeline whispered against his lips. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I have to. Because I choose to. because somehow in the middle of hunting a killer, I fell completely in love with you." Julian's smile was blinding. "Then keep the ring, Lady Evangeline, and everything that comes with it." "Everything?" she asked, heart soaring. "Everything," he promised. "Starting with the rest of our lives." And as the orchestra struck up a waltz and Julian spun her into the dance, Evangeline realized that sometimes the best stories don't end with happily ever after, they begin with it. Thank you for watching this love story to the very end on Dukes and Damsels. We truly hope it touched your heart and left you smiling. If you loved it, please like, comment, and share, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us keep creating emotional stories filled with love, pain, redemption, and unexpected twists. And before you go, click the next suggested video on your screen for another powerful story from Dukes and Damsels.